When you do a provisional cast on, I always find it useful to use yarn that is relatively slick, or even embroidery floss. I make a slip knot around my hook. And then I don't bother making a separate chain. I hold the tail along the side of my knitting needle. I lay the hook on top and I wrap all the way around. See that? Both the hook and the needle. And then I catch that yarn over under the hook and I walk it through the slip knot. Let's do it again. Yarn over, allow the yarn over to get caught, and pull through. Wrap all the way around both. See it? Catch it under the hook. Allow the hook to flow underneath the stitch that's on the hook. And now, do it again. See how that works? This way, my provisional cast on is done into my scrap yarn directly from a needle rather than from a chain. It's so much easier to do your first row using 2 knitting needles than it is to try to manipulate a knitting needle through a chain. After you have the number of stitches you want, make a few extra chains. The reason I like to make a few extra chains, just the chain, watch. Now I'm not going around the needle. Yes, it's kind of hanging out there in the background, but I am not going around the needle now. I've got the number of stitches I want on the needle. I call this part, between my 2 thumbs, my handle. Take the stitch marker, put it through that live stitch. I can cut that, and then we'll do our first row. So now that we have all of our stitches for our knitting on the hook, and we have our little pull for later, what we're going to do is, we don't need all this extra yarn, so I'm just going to cut this. Move it to the side. And now we're going to proceed with using these stitches and our yarn for our project, so our working yarn. I'll use a different color for the working yarn so you can see it a little bit better. You'll be able to see the provisional cast on. You don't have to use a different color when you have a provisional cast on, but I like to make sure that whatever yarn I'm using, it's just waste yarn when I am doing my provisional cast on, because why waste project yarn when you can just use something else? I tend to do the first row of stockinette as a purl row. You don't have to. Really, it's up to you. It's your project. I would suggest, until you're comfortable with the idea of using a provisional cast on, that you just very carefully read your project directions and decide what makes sense for you and your project. So now I have purled my first row, and I'm going to work my second row as a knit row. So let's say it's a project that has a lot of stockinette, and then, I don't know, maybe we need this provisional cast on because we're going to join on a button band, or we're going to join on, let's see, the hem perhaps. You can really join on whatever you need to join on with the provisional cast on point. And yes, this does work even if you're using straight needles as well, however you do your projects. The provisional cast on can work with straight needles, it can work with circular needles, it can work with double pointed needles. In general, I tend to use circulars because they're just a little bit easier for me. I spend a lot of time on the road. So as the rows of stockinette start to progress along on the project, you still see this area here where the two meet? You'll start to be able to read your work when you have a few more rows done, and then you'll be able to decide, maybe based on your own decision about how you'd like to experiment with this technique, or the project that you've decided to just cast on and start. When you're ready, after you have your work done in the working yarn to a point where you then want to work on the provisional cast off process, where you're actually going to remove the scrap yarn, this green, and start working from the other side of your project. You may have noticed when I first started working on my main project color, I just looped the yarn over, sort of laid it over the needle to do my first stitch. Right here, it's just a tiny bit loose. That can be tightened up later, don't worry about it. So you can start to see the rows as they progress. I'm going to do a few more rows and then we will look at how we would take our provisional cast on off so that we can then work in the opposite direction. You don't have to sit and watch that. I'll be right back. Welcome back. All right, now we're on the last row. It's just a little swatch piece, so we don't really have to be too concerned about how big it is. And I'm just going to use a very simple bind off here. Doesn't even matter, you can use any bind off you'd like. The reason I'm doing this one relatively loosey-goosey is just because that's not what the topic is today. Today's topic is the provisional cast on, and we're going to just take this off here so we can start working back on that. So we have the one stitch left. Right there. And then we're going to go back over here. Take this, put it through. Okay, this is the edge we're going to work on. Now, when I pick up my stitches from my provisional cast on, I don't like to use the same size needle as I used for the work. The reason is because it can be difficult sometimes to get the needle through. So instead, what I always suggest is if you step down a needle size or two, whatever you have handy, to pick up your stitches from the provisional cast on, it's a little bit easier to work. So here are my stitches for my provisional cast on. See them? just taking the needle across, and I'm only picking up the stitches that were part of that first row. See them? Now, remember how I said I have that little handle? I'm going to do that. As I take this out, see how the stitches are now sitting on that needle? So the actual size of the needle that you use when you pick up your stitches from the provisional cast on, by using a smaller needle, it just makes it a little bit easier to get those stitches picked up. And remember, when you work your first row from that provisional cast on in the opposite direction, when you work that row, you're going to use your needle for your project, because you don't want to use the smaller size needle to complement the size of the one that you pick the stitches up with. If you do, you'll change your gauge. So if you want your gauge to remain consistent when you work your first row, use the needle that you used for the rest of the project, which in our case is this one here. So how do we pick up our stitches? Well, our stitches are picked up on here now, and now we need to work this row using the other needle. Probably be easier for you to see it if we do it with a different color. So depending upon how you've picked up your stitches, if you only have a few like this, you may just want to leave them on the needle the way they are, and if some of them are twisted, you may want to untwist them as you work on the row. Otherwise, you may want to, if they're all the wrong way from what you want them to be, you may want to attach another cable and another needle and then slide the work to the other side. But I think it's important that you see a couple different ways of doing things. So I'm actually going to show you how I pick them up, and when I come to one that might be twisted, how I untwist it. If we look at this one, it looks a little twisted. So what I do is I just sort of walk it over to the other needle, and then I walk it back, and now it's not twisted. And I work it. So if there are only a couple that were that way, see how that one's also twisted? Walk it off, turn it around, and put it back on, and it's no longer twisted. But if the entire row was twisted, and you just wanted to work from the other side of the needle, you could do that too. So now, I have my work on the other needle again, and I can continue working in this direction. So just to make it a little bit more obvious where the yarns are joined, I did join in a different size yarn, so it's a little bit thicker here. Just so you see it nice, there's a nice graphic difference there. So that's how you use scrap yarn and a crochet hook to create your temporary provisional cast on, which you then use a smaller needle to pick up and then knit onto your project needle.